put your phone or device aside and immerse yourself in this audio story. Perfect for listening on the move, while relaxing, or for bedtime listening. We release new stories daily, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss out. This story is based on true events. The Invisible Vault. In a climate-controlled vault beneath Geneva, a Picasso worth $179 million sits in total darkness. No one has seen it in 7 years. The owner's name exists only as a numbered account in a Panamanian law firm that no longer answers its phones. The painting isn't hanging in a museum or adorning a billionaire's mansion. It's collateral for a loan that will never be repaid, bought with money that was never legally earned, stored in a warehouse that asks no questions. This is the billion-dollar art money laundering network, and what you're about to discover is how the most beautiful objects humanity has ever created became the perfect vehicle for the ugliest crimes. Because in the shadows of Christie's auction houses and elite galleries, a financial mystery has been hiding in plain sight. One that turns Monets into money, Rothkos into getaway cars, and the global art market into the world's largest unregulated bank. The story begins not in a boardroom, but in a moment of devastating clarity for an FBI agent named Robert Whitman. In 2003, Whitman had just recovered a stolen Rembrandt worth $36 million from a Philadelphia storage unit. But as he stood there, staring at the masterpiece that had been missing for decades, something bothered him. The man who'd been storing it, a mid-level accountant with no criminal record, lived in a modest suburban home. Yet in his storage unit sat artwork worth more than most people would earn in 1,000 lifetimes. When Whitman pressed him, the accountant said something that would haunt investigators for years. "I'm just holding it for someone." He never revealed who. He took a plea deal, served 18 months, and disappeared. The Rembrandt went back to its rightful owner. But Whitman couldn't shake a darker question. How many other priceless paintings were sitting in storage units, gathering dust, their real purpose having nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with moving money that couldn't be moved any other way? The answer would lead to the exposure of a financial mystery that law enforcement calls the last unregulated market on Earth. Because while every other industry faces scrutiny, banks report transactions over $10,000. Real estate deals require identity verification. Even car dealerships must comply with anti-money laundering laws. The art world operates in a shadows of secrecy that would make a Swiss banker blush. There are no registration requirements for art dealers, no mandatory reporting of suspicious transactions, no rules requiring galleries to verify the source of their clients' wealth. And until 2021, in the United States, absolutely no obligation to even ask a buyer's real name. This isn't an oversight. It's a feature. And it's precisely what makes the art market perfect for what financial investigators call trade-based money laundering. A system where the crime isn't hiding the money, but transforming its very nature through the simple act of purchase. Here's how the Invisible Vault actually works. A criminal organization in Eastern Europe earns $50 million through weapons trafficking, human smuggling, or cybercrime. That money sits in accounts that can't be touched. Wire it anywhere legitimate, and alarm bells sound across a dozen jurisdictions. But there's a solution, whispered about in certain circles, that's been perfected over decades of practice. The organization contacts a specialist, not quite a banker, not quite a dealer, operating in the gray space between legal commerce and criminal enterprise. This specialist has relationships with auction houses in New York, London, Hong Kong. Within weeks, a shell company incorporated in the British Virgin Islands, its true ownership hidden behind 6 layers of nominee directors, places the winning bid on a Modigliani at Sotheby's for $42 million. The payment comes from a bank in Cyprus, routed through accounts in Singapore and Luxembourg, each transaction just below the threshold that would trigger scrutiny. Sotheby's collects its commission and asks no questions because legally they're not required to. Now the magic happens. that Modigliani doesn't go to anyone's home. It goes directly to a freeport, massive tax-free warehouse complexes in Geneva, Luxembourg, Singapore, or Delaware, where billions of dollars in art sits in climate-controlled storage, never technically imported to any country, existing in a kind of legal limbo where it can be bought and sold endlessly without ever being seen, touched, or taxed. The painting has now been transformed from dirty money into a legitimate asset with a documented provenance, an auction record, a price history. And here's the beautiful irony that makes this business scandal so perfect. The longer it sits in storage, the more valuable it becomes. Art appreciates. 5 years later, that $42 million Modigliani is appraised at $65 million. The shell company takes out a loan against it, perfectly legal, and suddenly the original criminal organization has clean money, backed by a blue-chip asset, with a paper trail that looks entirely legitimate. But the true scale of this financial mystery only emerged when investigators started following one name that kept appearing in leaked documents: Yves Bouvier. Bouvier wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense. He was a Swiss art dealer who controlled the world's largest network of freeports, including the massive Geneva facility, where an estimated $100 billion in art sites in storage at any given moment. He was smooth, connected, brilliant at navigating the shadowy spaces between legality and crime. And for over a decade, he ran what prosecutors would eventually call the most sophisticated art manipulation scheme in history. His primary client was Dmitry Rybolovlev, a Russian oligarch worth $13 billion who'd made his fortune in potash fertilizer during the chaotic privatization of post-Soviet Russia. Wealth that came with a kind of moral ambiguity that defined that era's billionaire class. Rybolovlev wanted to buy art, lots of it, and he trusted Bouvier to be his exclusive dealer. What Rybolovlev didn't know was that Bouvier wasn't acting as his agent. He was acting as a middleman running the most profitable double-cross in art history. Between 2002 and 2014, Bouvier bought 38 masterpieces: Picassos, Rothkos, Modigliani's, Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, and immediately resold them to Rybolovlev at massively inflated prices, pocketing the difference. In one transaction, Bouvier bought a Modigliani for $93 million and sold it to Rybolovlev the same day for $118 million, a $25 million markup that happened in the time it took to sign 2 sets of papers. Over 12 years, Bouvier allegedly overcharged Rybolovlev by more than $1 billion. But here's where this business thriller takes its darkest turn. Bouvier's scheme only worked because the art market's secrecy allowed it. There are no price regulations, no disclosure requirements, no transparency about what dealers actually pay versus what they charge. Bouvier operated in the shadows by design, and those shadows protected not just his fraud, but something far larger and more sinister. Because while Rybolovlev was being overcharged by $1 billion, he was simultaneously using Bouvier's services for something else entirely. And this is where the real corporate scandal emerges. Leaked documents from Bouvier's Freeport network revealed that many of the paintings Rybolovlev bought never actually moved. They sat in Geneva, in storage units registered to shell companies, serving as collateral for loans from banks that specialized in art-backed lending. A growing corner of wealth and power that operates almost entirely outside regulatory oversight. The art wasn't being collected. It was being used as a financial instrument, a way to move money across borders, to avoid taxes, to transform wealth that might draw questions into assets that drew only admiration. And Rybolovlev wasn't alone. Investigators discovered that Bouvier's Freeport network had serviced clients from 73 countries, many of them politically exposed persons, dictators, arms dealers, sanctioned oligarchs, whose wealth could never be deposited in a legitimate bank, but could easily be converted into a Basquiat hanging in a warehouse in Singapore. The scope of what was really happening began to crystallize in 2016, when the Panama Papers exploded into public view. Among the 11.5 million leaked documents from the law firm Mossack Fonseca were thousands of files revealing how the global elite used offshore shell companies to buy art anonymously. One transaction stood out: a Modigliani nude purchased for $170 million by a shell company, whose ultimate beneficial owner was traced to a sanctioned Russian oligarch who legally shouldn't have been able to move money through Western financial systems at all. But by routing the purchase through a British Virgin Islands company, paying with funds from a Cypriot bank, and storing the painting in a Geneva free port, he'd moved $170 million without triggering a single compliance alert. The art market had become what one former Treasury official called the world's largest gap in the anti-money laundering framework. And the business crime went deeper still, because the art market's secrecy doesn't just enable money laundering, it actively incentivizes it through a perverse economic logic that rewards opacity. When legitimate buyers compete against money launderers at auction, prices get distorted beyond any rational valuation. In 2017, Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, a painting whose authenticity many scholars disputed, sold for $450 million, the highest price ever paid for artwork. The buyer was later identified as Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who allegedly purchased it through an intermediary to avoid public scrutiny, while his country was in the midst of an anti-corruption purge that was, ironically, seizing billions from other royals accused of money laundering. The painting hasn't been seen publicly since. It may be on his yacht. It may be in storage. No one knows because in the dark. Business story of high-end art. Visibility is optional, but price inflation is guaranteed. This creates a feedback loop that turns the art market into a machine for wealth concentration and criminal enterprise. Dirty money drives up prices at auction. Higher prices make art more attractive as a store of value for other criminals. More criminals entering the market drives prices higher still. Meanwhile, legitimate collectors and museums get priced out entirely, and the cultural heritage of humanity becomes locked in warehouses as financial instruments for people who've never looked at them. A 2020 study by Art Basel and UBS found that 75% of art purchases above $10 million were made by buyers who never publicly displayed what they bought. These weren't collectors. They were investors, wealth preservers, or worse, people turning masterpieces into offshore bank accounts that hung on walls, or more often, sat in darkness. The network extends beyond individual buyers into institutional complicity that reveals just how deep this corporate scandal runs. Major auction houses, Christie's, Sotheby's, Phillips, have been repeatedly caught facilitating transactions they should have questioned. In 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a civil forfeiture case against a Basquiat painting that had been purchased at auction by a Malaysian financier named Joe Low, who was simultaneously stealing $4.5 billion from his country's sovereign wealth fund in what became known as the 1MDB scandal. Low had bought the Basquiat for $48 million using money stolen from Malaysian citizens, and he'd done it through Christie's, which processed the payment, despite Low being a known person of interest in one of the largest financial crimes in Asian history. Christie's claimed they'd conducted due diligence. Investigators found otherwise. But by the time the painting was seized, Low had already used it as collateral for loans worth tens of millions. Clean money extracted from dirty art, bought with stolen funds. The same pattern appeared again and again. A Monet purchased by the son of Equatorial Guinea's dictator while his country faced famine. A Picasso bought by a Ukrainian oligarch 3 days before his bank collapsed, wiping out the savings of 300,000 depositors. A Rothko acquired by a Chinese real estate developer who was simultaneously running a Ponzi scheme that defrauded investors of $7 billion. In every case, the auction houses processed the sales, collected their commissions, and claimed ignorance of the source of funds. Because under existing regulations, ignorance was not just permissible, but profitable. But the true human cost of this billion-dollar art money laundering network only became clear when investigators in Germany uncovered something that revealed the moral abyss at the heart of this financial mystery. Stolen art was being laundered through the same networks. In 2012, customs officials in Munich stopped an elderly man named Cornelius Gerlit on a train from Switzerland. He was carrying 9,000 euros in cash, just below the declaration threshold. Something seemed off, so they searched his apartment. What they found stunned the art world. 1,280 paintings, drawings, and prints by masters including Picasso, Matisse, Renoir, and Toulouse-Lautrec, worth an estimated $1.35 billion. Gerlit's father had been one of Hitler's official art dealers, tasked with selling paintings confiscated from Jewish families during the Holocaust. Art that was never returned, never compensated for, stolen as part of the systematic destruction of European Jewry. For 70 years, this collection had remained hidden, and Gerlit had been quietly selling pieces through intermediaries who moved them into private collections and even museums, laundering not just money, but history itself, erasing the crimes of the past by integrating stolen masterpieces into legitimate markets where no one asked uncomfortable questions about provenance. The revelation sent shockwaves through the art establishment, but what followed was even more disturbing. Many of the paintings couldn't be definitively traced to specific Jewish families because the Nazis had kept deliberately incomplete records, and the art market's traditional secrecy meant there was no comprehensive documentation of who had owned what before the war. The same opacity that enabled modern money laundering had created a permanent fog over historical crimes, protecting thieves across generations. Museums and collectors who'd unknowingly bought looted art found themselves in an ethical nightmare, and many chose to fight restitution claims rather than admit they'd been trafficking in stolen goods. The business scandal wasn't just about criminal wealth. It was about how the art market's refusal to implement basic transparency had made it complicit in erasing the suffering of genocide victims, turning their confiscated culture into assets for the very institutions that claimed to preserve civilization. This dark revelation forced governments to finally act, though far more slowly than the scale of the crisis demanded. In 2020, the European Union implemented the fifth Anti-Money Laundering Directive, which for the first time required art dealers and free port operators to conduct customer due diligence and report suspicious transactions. In 2021, the United States followed with new regulations that brought art dealers under the Bank Secrecy Act, imposing the same anti-money laundering obligations faced by banks and jewelers. But these reforms came with caveats that revealed how deeply the industry had captured its regulators. Enforcement was left largely to self-reporting. Penalties for violations were minimal compared to banking fines, and the rules only applied to transactions above $50,000, a threshold so high that it excluded the vast majority of art sales. More troubling still, the regulations did nothing to address the core infrastructure that made art money laundering so effective: the free ports. These tax-free storage facilities continue to operate in a legal gray zone, with an estimated $400 billion in art sitting in just the top 5 global free ports, more than the GDP of many countries, stored in facilities that face minimal oversight and can hold works indefinitely without ever declaring them as imports or exports. The Geneva Freeport alone contains over 1.2 million pieces of art. And when Swiss authorities finally conducted an audit in 2016, after years of pressure, they discovered that 30% of the storage units were registered to shell companies whose beneficial owners couldn't be identified, even with international cooperation from law enforcement agencies. Billions of dollars in wealth, sitting in the dark, owned by ghosts. Meanwhile, the key figures in this business thriller have largely escaped accountability in ways that reveal the ultimate lesson about wealth and power. When you operate at a certain level of the financial elite, consequences become optional. Yves Bouvier was charged in multiple jurisdictions, Switzerland, Monaco, France, but has avoided conviction through legal maneuvering and jurisdictional complexity, with his lawyers arguing that overcharging a client isn't fraud if the client chose to pay. He continues to operate his Freeport business, now expanding into Asia and the Middle East, markets with even less regulatory oversight than Europe. Dmitry Rybolovlev settled his civil case against Bouvier for an undisclosed sum, and despite being caught in the Panama Papers, faced no criminal charges, eventually selling his art collection, including the overpriced pieces Bouvier sold him, at auction, recouping much of his money, and even profiting on some sales as the inflated market he'd helped create pushed prices higher still. The billionaire secrets embedded in this story reveal a profound truth about how modern wealth operates. It exists not in bank accounts or real estate, but in movable, untraceable stores of value that can cross borders as easily as hanging a painting on a different wall. Or more often, not hanging it at all, but storing it in a vault that exists everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously. For the ultra-wealthy, art has become the ultimate hedge against transparency, a way to preserve and move capital that's superior to gold, cryptocurrency, or offshore accounts, because it carries cultural prestige that makes scrutiny seem like Philistinism. Who questions someone buying a Picasso? Who investigates a collector preserving humanity's cultural heritage? The answer, historically, has been almost no one. And that's precisely the point. Today, the billion-dollar art money laundering network continues to evolve, adapting to new regulations the way sophisticated criminal enterprises always do, by finding fresh vulnerabilities in the global financial system. The latest frontier is NFTs, non-fungible tokens, digital art that exists only on blockchain networks and can be bought, sold, and transferred anonymously with even less regulation than physical paintings. In 2021, a digital artwork by the artist Beeple sold for $69 million at Christie's, paid for in cryptocurrency by an anonymous buyer whose identity remains unknown. Treasury officials warned that NFTs represented the Wild West of money laundering, a perfect vehicle for washing dirty money because the transactions happen on decentralized networks that no single government can regulate, with values that can be easily manipulated through wash trading, buying and selling to yourself to create false price history, and ownership that can be transferred across borders in seconds. The invisible vault had gone digital, and with it came infinite new ways to transform crime into culture, theft into treasure. The business lessons hidden in this financial mystery are as dark as they are instructive. First, secrecy is not a bug in elite markets. It's the premium product, more valuable than the assets themselves, because opacity allows the same item to serve multiple purposes simultaneously. Art, investment, tax shelter, criminal infrastructure. Second, regulation without enforcement is permission, a fact proven by art market reforms that imposed rules but allocated almost no resources to verify compliance, creating the appearance of action while preserving the profitable status quo. Third, cultural institutions are not immune to corruption. Museums, auction houses, and galleries that present themselves as guardians of civilization have proven willing to facilitate crimes as long as the commission checks clear. A reminder that prestige and morality are entirely separate categories. But perhaps the most chilling insight is this. The art money laundering network succeeds because it exploits something fundamentally human: our desire to believe that beauty and crime occupy different worlds, that a Monet in a museum is somehow spiritually distinct from a Monet in a Freeport vault, serving as collateral for a loan to an arms dealer. The truth is, they're the same painting, and the only difference is which story we choose to tell ourselves about it. The art world understood this long before criminals did, and it built an entire industry on the principle that value is subjective, provenance is malleable, and questions are impolite. The money launderers simply followed that logic to its natural conclusion. Today, somewhere in a climate-controlled storage unit in Geneva or Singapore or Delaware, a masterpiece worth $100 million sits in total darkness, unseen by human eyes, owned by a shell company, registered in a jurisdiction that doesn't keep ownership records, serving as collateral for a loan that will finance another crime, another scheme, another transformation of dirty money into clean capital. And tomorrow, at Christie's or Sotheby's, another painting will sell for a price that makes no economic sense, bought by a buyer who will never be named, using money whose origins will never be questioned, adding another data point to a market that grows more opaque and more expensive with each transaction. The billion-dollar art money laundering network isn't an aberration in the global financial system. It's a feature, carefully constructed and jealously protected, because for those who operate at the intersection of extreme wealth and questionable legality, there is no better vehicle than a Picasso for moving money that can't be moved, hiding wealth that can't be hidden, and transforming crimes into culture. That Picasso in the Geneva vault? It hasn't been seen in 7 years, and if the pattern holds, it won't be seen for 7 more. Because in the shadows of the art world, invisibility isn't a problem. It's the entire business model. And the vault door stays locked, guarding secrets that were never meant to see daylight, in a market that prefers its masterpieces and its crimes to remain in the dark. Subscribe and listen to our next story below.